All right, so if we go through our succession of kings of Babylon, we started with Nebuchadnezzar, which he was mentioned very briefly earlier on in our study. He was ruler from 626 to 605 BC, and now we're in the era of Nebuchadnezzar II, which is 605 to 562 BC. After Nebuchadnezzar's reign, there's this king that's briefly mentioned. His name was Evil Merodach. He reigned from year 562 to 560 BC. He had a very short reign. Then you had Neriglissar, which was 560 to 556. Then you have Labashi Marduk, was just in 556. He only reigned for a few months. And this is coming from Babylonian history, by the way. Then we had Nabonidus, which reigned from 556 to 539 BC. And finally we have Belshazzar, which reigns from 549 to 539 BC, the last 10 years of the existence of Babylon. After this time, Persia will rise up and consume Babylon. So we're going to move forward to Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to pick up during that reign of Belshazzar. And this probably takes place during the time that Belshazzar is co-reigning with his father Nabonidus. So it's not like this is during the years where Belshazzar is reigning by himself from 549 to 539. This is while he's co-reigning with his father. And history tells us that Nabonidus was off in other regions acting as a diplomat and trying to expand the empire, expand the Babylonian Empire at this time. And his son, Belshazzar, is left behind to rule in his place. So that's why they're co-reigning. In Daniel chapter 7, we get a retelling of the events that took place in Daniel chapter 2. If you remember back to Daniel chapter 2, you'll remember that there was this statue that Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream of. And it started with a head of gold, which represented Babylon, the chest and arms of silver, which represented the Medes and the Persians, the belly and thighs of Greece, the belly and thighs of bronze, which represented Greece, and then we had the legs and feet of iron and clay that represented Rome. Well, in Daniel chapter 7, it's the same meaning, but a totally different dream. And there in Daniel chapter 7, the animal or the beast that represents Babylon is a lion with eagle's wings. And you move, we'll just use the statue. As you move further down, you have Persia, which is represented by a bear. And then you have the next level down, you have Greece, which is represented by a leopard with wings. And this leopard also has 4 heads. And interestingly enough, the Greek empire is divided up into 4 individual kingdoms after Alexander the Great dies. And then you have this last beast, which is represented, it's just some kind of mongrel, a beast that has 10 horns. And he has a blasphemous horn that speaks blasphemies. This horn is speaking blasphemies. And that would be Rome. And remember when we talked about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had seen all those years before in Daniel chapter 2, we had talked about that we're still in Rome now. We're still using the Roman calendar. There's still a lot of things that we do was Roman. And the reason why we say that we're still in Rome, because there has not been another gigantic and larger unifying empire that consumes all the previous area of Rome. And remember, Rome stretched all the way from United Kingdom all the way down into Afghanistan and India, all the way over into Spain and North Africa. So Rome was this gigantic beast of an empire, and there's not been another empire since that has expanded and consumed all of that land. And remember, I showed you on that timeline of how after Rome falls apart, it splits up into millions of different streams of civilization that break out. And then in the future, all of those will be assumed into a future kingdom under Christ during the millennial reign. But until then, there is no other one. We're living in the time of this 4th beast, the mongrel beast with the 10 horns, the one that had the blasphemous horn. So we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 7, verse 15. It says, I, Daniel, was troubled by all I had seen, and my visions terrified me. So I approached one of those standing beside the throne and asked what it all meant. He explained to me like this: these 4 huge beasts represent 4 kingdoms, just like the statue that we read in Daniel chapter 2. that will rise from the earth. But in the end, the holy people of the Most High will be given the kingdom, and they will rule forever and ever. So that's that empire that's going during the millennial reign, that's going to consume a remnant of Rome, basically. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, the one so different from the others and so terrifying. That was that mongrel beast. It had devoured and crushed its victims with iron teeth and bronze claws, trampling with the remains beneath its feet. I also asked about the 10 horns on the fourth beast's head and the little horn that came up afterward and destroyed 3 of the other horns. This horn had seemed greater than the others, and it had human eyes and a mouth that was boasting arrogantly. As I watched, this horn was waging war against God's holy people and was defeating them until the Ancient One, the Most High, came and judged in favor of his holy people. Then the time arrived for the holy people to take over the kingdom. Then he said to me, the fourth beast is the fourth world power that will rule the earth. It will be different from all the others. It will devour the whole world, trampling and crushing everything in its path. Its 10 horns are 10 kings who will rule that empire. Then another king will arise that's different from the other 10 who will subdue 3 of them. He will defy the Most High and oppress the holy people of the Most High. He will try to change their sacred festivals and laws, and they will be placed under his control for a time, times and a half a time. But then the court will pass judgment, and all his power will be taken away and completely destroyed. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be given to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will last forever, and all rulers will serve and obey him. So this here, Daniel chapter 7, totally aligns with this timeline that I just went through, with the statue and then the future, that the fact that we're still in Rome now, and then the next unifying kingdom after that will be Christ, who will overthrow the Antichrist. Then Daniel chapter 8, we can't miss this. Daniel chapter 8, Daniel has a vision of a ram and a goat. And this is about 2 years later in 551 BC. This is during the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign. He had another vision. And it says, I saw a ram with 2 long horns standing beside the river. One of the horns was longer than the other, even though it had grown later than the other one. The ram butted everything out of its way to the west, to the north, to the south, and no one could stand against him or help his victims. He did as he pleased and became very great. This is the ram, which is Persia. While I was watching, suddenly a male goat appeared from the west. That's Alexander the Great, crossing the land so swiftly that it didn't even touch the ground. So Alexander, when he expanded his kingdom, it was all done in a very short amount of time. And the Greek Empire, led by Alexander, even went as far as into Afghanistan. This goat, which had one very large horn between his eyes, headed toward the 2-horned ram that I had seen standing beside the river, rushing at him in a rage. The goat charged fiercely at the ram and struck him, breaking off both his horns. So the goat hit the ram, broke off the ram's horns. The ram was helpless, and the goat knocked him down and trampled him. No one could rescue the ram from the goat's power. So the Greeks hit the Persians and overthrew the Persians. And that's what that entire vision is about. Gabriel explains it in verses 15 through 27. He explains it to him. We'll go down to verse 19. Then he said, this is Gabriel speaking, I am here to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath. What you have seen pertains to the very end of time. The 2-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy male goat represents the king of Greece, Alexander the Great. And the large horn between his eyes represents the first king of the Greek Empire. That's Alexander. The 4 prominent horns that replace the one large horn show that the Greek Empire will break into 4 kingdoms, but none as great as the first. And that's exactly what happens to Alexander's empire. It's broken up into 4 different kingdoms, led by his generals. So Alexander dies on his way back to Macedon, and when he invaded India, on his way home, he dies. And they still don't know where Alexander's grave or his tomb is. His empire was divided up amongst his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonid, and Attalid. So the Ptolemaic Empire is centered in Egypt. And you will probably remember the story of Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the last queen of Egypt, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They were actually descendants of the general Ptolemy, who was a Greek. And Cleopatra was that last descendant of Ptolemy who ruled there in Egypt before the Romans took over. Then you had Seleucus. Seleucus, his seat of power was in Turkey and Syria and there. You had Antagonid, which took over the original homeland of Alexander over in Macedon and Greece. And then you had Attalid, or sometimes called Pergamon, he ruled in Asia Minor, which was further east. Years later, before that happens, when Alexander is coming through Jerusalem, there's a Roman/Jewish historian named Josephus, and he told a story of how Alexander was shown this passage in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, and how Greece would conquer Persia. And evidently Alexander was very pleased by this, and that the Jewish religion had some truth to it, because they acknowledged him. They acknowledged that Alexander would overthrow the Persians. And so Alexander marches up into the city, up to the temple. Out comes some Levites with a scroll. They unroll the scroll. They read Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, and they said, hey, we knew you were coming. We knew you were coming to overthrow the Persians. And Alexander, therefore, granted the right for the Jews to live according to their own religion and law, which it wasn't the policy of Alexander. Alexander was a Hellenizer. He imposed the Greek religion, the Greek pantheon, on every place that he invaded and took over. He imposed their culture, he imposed their religion. It was forced upon the people. So he made an exception with Judah. Now this is during the Second Temple era. They could stay worshiping Yahweh and stay with their culture and have their own laws. And that was all because of Daniel chapter 8. And in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel's called to read some writing on the wall that Belshazzar sees. There's a hand, basically the hand of God, shows up and writes some stuff on the wall that Belshazzar can't read, so he gets Daniel to come and interpret it for him. And it says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin in the NLT here. That's the words that they use. And it just basically means, God has numbered the days of your reign. You've been found wanting. Your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And we're still under the Babylonian period. Remember, Belshazzar is the last emperor of Babylon. And now that writing on the wall tells them, this is where the saying, hey, I saw the writing on the wall. This is literally the writing on the wall. This is where that saying comes from. Daniel interprets the writing on the wall and says, hey, you're going to be overthrown. You've been found wanting. You're not doing the job that Nebuchadnezzar had done. You found wanting. You're going to be overthrown. Your kingdom is going to be given to the Medes and the Persians. And it's so, and it actually happens. And in Daniel chapter 9, this is after the Persian takeover. The emperor of the Medes and the Persians was basically two kingdoms that joined together to overtake Babylon. This is Darius the Mede. He divides them up, and he divides Persia up into basically like a republic. Each one is ruled by their own, and he gives Daniel a lot of administrative power. This makes the other Persians and Median people that are in the king's court, the emperor's court, makes them jealous. They want to find a way to get rid of Daniel. They pass a law that says that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to Darius, will be thrown into the den of lions. And of course, Daniel refuses to pray to Darius, and he continues to pray to Yahweh, as he's been doing throughout the entire exile that they've been. And now this is 70 years later, so we know Daniel is way up there in years, because he was one of the original exiles that was taken from Jerusalem. And so they throw Daniel in the lion's den, and Daniel doesn't get eaten by the lions, and we all are familiar with that story there. And then we get to Daniel chapter 9, about when it comes to the 77s. Daniel's talking to Gabriel again. And he says, I went on praying and confessing my sin, the sin of my people, pleading with the Lord my God for Jerusalem, his holy mountain. As I was praying, Gabriel, whom I had seen in the earlier vision, came swiftly to me at the time of the evening sacrifice. He explained to me, Daniel, I've come here to give you an insight and understanding. The moment you began praying, a command was given, and now I'm here to tell you what it was. For you are very precious to God. Listen carefully so that you can understand the meaning of your vision. And what is told here to Daniel is still a debated thing even till today. Like, no one truly grasps what's going on. At least they get the first part, but the second part not so much. Verse 24, Gabriel says, A period of 70 sets of 7 has been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for the guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and anoint the most holy place. Now listen and understand. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. So this gives us some actual events to go on. When the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem, we know that, right? We know what time that is. We just read that this week. And it says that will be 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until the time of the anointed one. So it gives us a certain set of time. There's been a lot of theories about this, but not a lot of people have really nailed it down. So the 7s means the 7-year periods, okay? So there's no word in the English language for 7, for a set of 7. So earlier translators, like in the King James, would call it a week. So some translations say there's a period of 70 weeks. And that doesn't mean that there's literally like 7 sets of 7-day periods. These weeks are representative of 7 periods of time. So there's 77s or 70 weeks that Daniel 9 gives reference to. And there's 7 sets of 7. 7 sets of 7 equals 490 years, right? So if you have 7 years, and there's 7 sets of those, so 7 times 7, 490 years. A 7 is equal to 7 years. So some of the brightest biblical scholars have tried to figure out this addition to predict the second coming of Jesus. And none of them have been able to do that. And go figure, Jesus told us himself not to worry about that. But interestingly enough, and back in the Mosaic Law, remember they were told to observe every seventh year as a Sabbath year. That was a special year. And then remember, every 70 years was the year of Jubilee. And remember that was part of the reason why them being sent into exile in Babylon for a period of 70 years was because they didn't observe those, they didn't let the earth rest. And so God made a way for all the tribal areas of Israel to get its 70 years of rest because the Jews were actually exiled in Babylon during those 70 years. So most biblical scholars can come up with a good, strong defense of why this foretells an accurate representation of the first coming of Jesus. Down in verse 26, or it's down in verse 25, it says, "Now listen and understand, 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem." So that's the time we're at now in our study, where they're rebuilding Jerusalem. "Until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times." 7 sets of 7 we know is 490 years. And then we have the 62 sets of 7 that will pass, okay? So we know that 7 sets of 7 was 490 years. Will get us to about the time of the first coming of Jesus. But then the second coming of Jesus is a little fuzzy, and we don't know how long that last 7 actually is. So it all gets really fuzzy. Don't get wrapped up in it. There's been lots of people that thought that they could determine when the second coming of Jesus was going to be. But there's actually no way to do that because we're not supposed to know. It does say there in verse 27 of chapter 9, it says, "A ruler will make a treaty with the people for a period of 1 set of 7, but after half this time he will put an end to the sacrifices and offerings." And that is telltale of the Antichrist. "And as a climax to all his terrible deeds, he will set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration until the fate decreed for this defiler is finally poured out on him." Daniel obviously was supposed to know this, but it's so cryptic, no one can really figure out the math in this situation. If we had the knowledge that Daniel had, if we had received this vision like Daniel did, we would be able to actually understand this. But we, in our limited view this many years later, it's hard to tell. Plus, Jesus tells us himself in Matthew 24. It says, as Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. He responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. No, not one stone will be left on top of the other. And we know that that took place in 70 AD. Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately, said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming that I am the Messiah." So there'll be lots of people coming after Jesus that says that they are the Messiah. They will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. That's the era we're living in now. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people, as is happening now. Sin will be rampant everywhere. Yeah. And the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world, so that all nations will hear it, and the end will come. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. So this is where Jesus is retelling what we just read there in Daniel chapter 9. And he's given us a much easier version, without all the addition and multiplication and stuff. So this is something that's going to take place in Israel, will happen to Israel. Israel will then have to leave, and this was also prophesied in Ezekiel. And then it says, "Then if anyone tells you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. See, I have warned you about this ahead of time." So Jesus tells us a series of events that's got to happen. So there's no use in doing all that math. Matthew chapter 24, it tells us the series of events that's going to happen there. And Paul talks about this as well later on. We'll read that as well, about how these series of events that's got to happen in the order that they happened in. So, but there is, if you have the wisdom of Daniel, there is Gabriel is already given to Daniel here in chapter 9 of how these events that take place and how many years there are between them. We're going to return back to our narrative, to our storyline. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 22, about 538 BC, it says, "In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given through Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put his proclamation in writing and to send it throughout his kingdom." Verse 23, this is what King Cyrus of Persia says: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth. He has appointed me to build a temple at Jerusalem, which is at Judah. Any of you who are his people may go there for this task, and may the Lord your God be with you." So this is Cyrus saying that, hey, you Jews that were exiled here during the reign of Babylon, you can return and you can rebuild your temple. And he allows their return there in 538 BC. Okay? But this was already prophesied from Isaiah back in 700 BC, 160 years earlier. In Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, Isaiah says, "When I say of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, he will certainly do as I say. He will command, rebuild Jerusalem. He will say, restore the temple." This is 160 years before Cyrus is even king of Persia. In chapter 45, verse 1, it says, "This is what the Lord says to Cyrus, his anointed one, whose right hand he will empower." Verse 13, "I will raise up Cyrus to fulfill my righteous purpose, and I will guide his actions. He will restore my city and free my captive people without seeking a reward." We just read there in 2 Chronicles, it gave credit of Isaiah's prophecy to Jeremiah. Well, we just have that book of Jeremiah. That doesn't mean that Jeremiah wasn't actually out in Jeremiah's time prophesying about this. Just because we don't have it recorded in the book of Jeremiah doesn't mean that Jeremiah wasn't actually out there prophesying about the same thing that Isaiah had prophesied before. So some people see this as a contradiction. I see it's a detail that doesn't even really matter. But the same thing happens in Ezra. Ezra chapter 1, it says that King Cyrus of Persia fulfilled the prophecy that had been given through Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus. And then King Cyrus himself brought out the articles that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his own gods. Remember, they were drinking from some of these vessels during the time that Belshazzar saw the writing on the wall. The rest of this week went through, they were building the city, and then some of the neighbors would stop them because they would warn the Persian emperor about, hey, you know, these people were a rebellious people, and then the Persian emperor would cease their building, and then the Jews would have to reach back out to the emperor and tell him, hey, check your records. You know, Cyrus said that we were allowed to do this. It was already decreed. Are you going to go back on the words of Cyrus? And the emperor ends up saying, no, I won't do that. You can continue building it. And there are several occasions where the people of the area don't want the Jews to rebuild the city and don't want them to rebuild the temple. The temple is actually even stopped at one point, and then continues on to be built. Meanwhile, Daniel gets another vision of the time of the end. And Daniel asks, he says, how will all this finally end, my Lord? In verse 9 of Daniel chapter 12, he says, but he said, go now, Daniel, for what I have said is kept secret and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, cleansed, and refined by these trials. But the wicked will continue in their wickedness, and none of them will understand. Only those who are wise will know what it means. And this is that refining fire that we've seen talked about several times, where God puts us through the fire, and we are cleansed through the fire, and we come out refined on the other side. We've talked about this concept several times. We've talked about the silver, how the silver is refined. We're refined by trials. And here, God's putting it right here in front of us that this is what's happening. And then we ask ourselves, well, why is the wicked allowed to continue on being wicked, but us that have given our lives to Christ, we go through all these trials in life? Because God is refining us by these trials for us to be the people that we're to be, to accomplish His purpose. And the wicked are allowed to go on and continue being wicked. Verse 11, from the time the daily sacrifices stopped, this is talking about the Antichrist who's going to abolish the daily sacrifice. Later on, we'll read about this again in Revelation. The daily sacrifices stopped, and the sacrilegious object that causes desecration is set up to be worshipped. There'll be some kind of idol that's put up in the temple area. That's the third temple that's not built yet. There will be 1,290 days. And blessed are those who wait and remain until the end of 1,335 days. As for you, go your way until the end, and you will rest. And then at the end of the days, you will rise again to receive the inheritance set aside for you. So here we are. God is telling Daniel that he will rise again. Okay, at the end of that period. So we kind of get this succession of events. All the believers are going to rise up from their grave at the end of that period. And as we get over into the book of Zechariah, we also get a lot of prophecy there. Now, Zechariah's prophecy takes place during the time that they're rebuilding the temple. That's the second temple. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it says, rejoice, O people of Zion, shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey's colt. And this is the prophecy that is fulfilled when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, a week before they crucify him. And all the people lay out their palm branches, and they all are saying, Hosanna, Hosanna. And they're saying that the Messiah has arrived because of this prophecy here in Zechariah chapter 9. And that's exactly what happens. Jesus rides in on the colt of a donkey. After that, he says, I'll remove the battle chariots from Israel, the war horses from Jerusalem, and destroy all the weapons used in battle. Your king will bring peace to the nations. His realm will stretch from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. This is talking about the millennial reign, so the second coming of Jesus. So verse 9 talks about the first coming of Jesus, and the rest of this talks about the second coming of Jesus. Zechariah 14, we get more information about this millennial reign on earth. Watch, for the day of the Lord is coming, when your possessions will be plundered right in front of you. I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. The city will be taken, the houses looted, the women raped. Half the population will be taken in captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. Then the Lord will go out to fight against those nations who have done all those evil things, as he has fought in times past, on the day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will be split apart, making a wide valley running from east to west. Half the mountain will be moved to the north, half toward the south. Then we hit that Mount of Olives thing again. Remember, the glory of the Lord is going to return over the Mount of Olives to the east, and the people will flee. Then there will be this battle. It says the Lord will send a plague on all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their people will become like walking corpses, their flesh rotting away, their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. On that day they will be terrified, stricken by the Lord with great panic. They will fight their neighbors hand to hand. Judah too will be fighting at Jerusalem. So there's the actual fight. Again, this is that passage we were reading about, that the events that take place that Ezekiel was prophesying about, where people are actually fighting. And that's that third temple era. The third temple era, the era that takes place before the second coming of Christ, and the temple that's still there during the second coming of Christ. Alright, so next week we're going to talk about the book of Esther, which is a vertical book that takes place during this time that we're going through in our horizontal books that we're reading. We're reading through Ezra right now, Zechariah, which are our horizontal books that are moving time forward. During that time where we have the vertical book of Esther. Next week we're going to talk about the entirety of Esther, events that took place there, and we're going to continue forward in our timeline. I hope this video, I know there was a lot in this video. You can slow it down, take it all in, look back at your Bible. There's a lot going on this week, but I hope that I've done a good job to kind of scratch through the surface. There's years and years and years of study can be done just on what we've covered today. So I hope that it kind of clarified for you a little bit. I hope this week treats you well. Stay close to the Lord. Seek His will in all things. And share your testimony with somebody this week.